bunch of teachers, both middle school, elementary, high school, and university. Okay, my name is Frank Smith. I teach at IUPUI, and today I'm going to be talking to you about using comic books, those things you grew up with, as a valid cultural, grammar, and academic and creative writing classroom tool. If you were to ask my father the definition of a comic book, he would probably say, oh, it's one of those funny books that kids read. But unfortunately, it's not really descriptive enough when we're talking about this in a more academic context. So probably the easiest definition of comic books is to refer to them as sequential art in narrative form. However, there is actually scholarship around comic books, and you can actually get your PhD in comic book studies at, I think it's Central Michigan. And there you might encounter a more complex definition like this, which would be juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And if we go by the second definition, we end up with a definition that is much more closely attuned to literature, to things that we use in the classroom to encourage students to write, to talk about ideas, to promote critical thinking. So I like the second definition, personally. I'm going to talk about a little bit of background information first that's not really relevant to the classroom. I'll go through it fairly quickly. Okay, so when we talk about comic books, and more importantly, when you talk about them with your ESL students, you should know that there are really three primary schools of comic books. So your students' experience with comic books may differ depending on the culture in which they were born. A major school of comics is European comics, often divided into English comics, French and Belgian, which are similar styles, and the Italian, beginning in the early 19th century. One that you may already be familiar with are Japanese comics, which are older than any other comics that we have, beginning primarily in the 18th century, initially as woodblock carvings that were used to then print on paper. And they were initially intended for less literate people, but very quickly by like the late 18th century, 1775, 1780, you see the rise of comic books called kirobishi in Japanese comics that are intended for an adult audience. And indeed, the very first comic book for adults may have come from Japan. But I'm not going to talk about European or Japanese comics today because I'm not super familiar with them. I'm going to focus on US comics and how I've used them in the classroom and issues around using them in the classroom. Some other things, depending on your perception of comic books at the moment, notice up here, we're going to be talking about comic books. So I'm not really going to focus on comic strips, which might be what you grew up reading in the newspaper, particularly on Sunday when they were in color. I'm also not really focusing on graphic novels, which are different from comic books in that comic books are typically serial fiction, and graphic novels are usually a much longer story form that is both art and story, and it's intended to be published in one chunk. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen an enormous rise in webcomics, which typically are more like comic strips, but on the internet. As of 2010, there were more than 40,000 webcomics available on the internet. More than 40,000. It is an incredibly productive medium. For one reason one reason is that the cost is so much less expensive. You don't have to deal with printing. And also, comic books as we know them, Superman, the Lone Ranger, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, these are all monitored by the Comic Code Authority. They're monitored for content, sometimes censored. Web comics, on the other hand, have no such controlling medium. So there is incredible freedom of artistic expression. And finally, we see this rise of web comics because with the internet, there is an opportunity to explore a lot of different mediums for the creation of the art, a lot of different ways to juxtapose the art and the text. And web comics is really a place where someone can exploit that. However, although there are over 40,000 web comics, very few of them are financially successful. They're not really produced to make money, usually. And the ones that are financially successful typically become successful because they are either A, put into print form, adapted into print form, or B, optioned for a movie, or C, both. And really it's the movie thing. If you think about it, that's where the money is. But I'm not really going to focus on webcomics because in a very real sense, it's a different medium from the kind of comic that you would use in the classroom with your students. Maybe. Let me say maybe. Okay, so if we talk about the traditional perception of American comics or US comics, some of the common perceptions are that comic books are pulp or fantasy, also disposable literature. In World War II, kids showed their patriotism by recycling their comics, taking their comics to be recycled for the paper. So in that sense, children, we come from a perception of children may love their comic books, but they can also get rid of them for a greater cause without much heartbreak. Comic books historically also, as the means of publication, have traditionally been controlled by white men. Comic books typically, up until about the 1980s or 1990s, demonstrate a significant lack of diversity and are sometimes plagued with racial stereotypes. And we'll look at a few examples. Comic books are also sometimes perceived as having kind of an imbalance when it comes to gender. Most comic books that are published have if they're named after a hero, they're named after a male hero. Currently, there are only 3 comic books that are published on a regular basis with a female as the lead, with the female hero's name up there in great big print. But it's changing, it's getting better. And so I think these 3 things lead to us as educators worrying about quality issues of using comic books in the classroom. So you may wonder to yourself, why bother? If we have issues of stereotyping, if we have gender issues, if we have quality issues, why would we bother? So I'm going to show you a panel of one of my favorite panels that helps explain this. This is by a comicologist named Scott McCloud, and I'm going to walk from panel to panel and just read what it says to you in case you can't see it. The first panel says, the longer any form of art or communication exists, the more symbols it accumulates. The second panel, the modern comic is a young language, but it already has an impressive array of recognizable symbols. And the third panel, and this visual vocabulary has an unlimited potential for growth. And then in the fourth panel, within a given culture, these symbols will quickly spread until everyone knows them at a glance. So if we look at the first panel, we see this face that gets repeated in all panels, but the eyes are a swirl. So what does this mean? can I ask a question? Is that okay? Is that too disruptive?
Well, you can ask the question. You just won't get the
Let me call on you, Janet. What does this mean? How does he feel?
He feels confused.
He feels confused. In the second panel, what state is he in? His little eyes are X's.
Asleep?
Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's passed out.
Dead.
Maybe he's dead. In the third panel, we see his eyes, but he has this cross-hatching over his face. How does he feel?
Invisible.
Maybe he feels invisible. Maybe a girl has just turned him down for a date. Shy or embarrassed. And then here, in this fourth panel, we see all of these little lines all outside of his head. What's happening to him? He's having an epiphany.
Finally realized
This is visual language. Even without text that tells you how he feels, we can recognize how he feels, and your students can recognize how he feels. Even if it's not precise, it carries the student into the realm of understanding. It's a form of communication. Okay. Also, so that's one reason to use comics in the classroom. Another reason is the current reality of American comics. And I'm just going to briefly focus on resurging prevalence in the media, development of more sophisticated content and recognition of form, increasing diversity, and then we'll talk about comics as an experimental tool in a variety of class activities and potential as text. Maybe you saw one of these movies in the last 4 years. Spider-Man, or the X-Men, or Daredevil, or the Hulk, or the Fantastic Four, or Iron Man, or Blade, or Thor. Maybe you saw Blade 2 and Blade 3. Maybe you saw Iron Man 2. Maybe you saw Fantastic Four 2. Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3. And then Spider-Man has just been rebooted. I think it's inarguable that there is a resurgence of the superhero in popular media. However, it's not just superheroes. Maybe you saw Road to Perdition, which won Academy Awards. Starred Tom Hanks, Paul Newman, and Jude Law. Was directed by the dude who directed American Beauty, which was also an Oscar-winning film. Road to Perdition was originally a comic book. Or maybe you saw A History of Violence with Viggo Mortensen, which I don't think won but was nominated for an Oscar. And a beautiful film. Here, on the jacket of the Blu-ray disc, identified as the best movie of the year. History of Violence was originally a comic book.